It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to your number one and favorite podcast, Don't Quill the Messenger. We're so glad that you can be listening to us from wherever you are. I've received comments from some of our listeners, including one who says that she likes to listen while gardening, which is a new one for me. So if you're out there in the garden and you've got us in your head, then that's okay with us. I want to put a shout out there to Bob Stanley, who writes to us from across the pond. I use that slang colloquialism for across the Atlantic Ocean because Bob has a pet peeve about what he calls vocabulary and grammar issues. He doesn't like it when I say that's a whole nother story, which I commonly use on the podcast to defer away from topics that tend to stray into a field that is beyond whatever the episode happens to be, each episode that we do here. So I wanted to put a shout out there to Bob. Thanks, Bob, for the email. Appreciate you listening. Appreciate you sending your comments. And that's an entirely different story, is what I'll try to say from now on. But, you know, old habits die hard. Anyway, today's program is an extremely exciting program, and it is indeed an entirely different story. And we have a special guest with us today who is going to answer some questions that some of you have written to us about over the last 2 years as being issues that stick in your mind or issues that you feel have gone unanswered or undebated on this program and in other realms. His name is William Boyle. We call him Bill. He's a retired librarian. He graduated from Lake Forest College and SUNY Albany in the 1990s, and he founded and managed websites on the Authorship Question throughout that time, including the Shakespeare Oxford Society homepage in 1995 and the Ever Reader in 1996. He then served as editor of the Shakespeare Oxford newsletter from 96 to 2001 and Shakespeare Matters from 2001 to 2005. In 2006, he did something extraordinary. He founded the New England Shakespeare Oxford Library, and you can find that at shakespeareoxfordlibrary.org, which manages the Shakespeare Online Authorship Resources Catalog. That's SOAR, S-O-A-R. It's a database of Shakespeare authorship materials and publishes authorship-related books through its Forever Press imprint. Bill, welcome to the program. So glad to have you today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Now, Bill, one of the things that you published through Forever Press imprint was a book that you edited and contributed articles to that was a result of a famous film that many of our listeners have seen and continues to this day to raise issues and questions thanks to our pal Roland Emmerich. And it's a movie called Anonymous that raises two very particular issues, two theories and theses that are out there that are called Prince Tudor theories. Yes, I know it's such a controversial subject that even today it tends to sometimes split Oxfordians right down the middle. What is the history of that? Where does that come from? Why do we even discuss this? Why is it continue to be such a controversial topic? And what light can you shed on that for us and our listeners who constantly send me emails asking me what this whole thing is all about?
Oh my goodness. How
there you go. Look, that's the best loaded question I can give you. We have an hour. Go.
Yeah, I could just talk. Well, the large view of it is it's grounded in trying to answer the question of how and why did the greatest author in Western literature get dispossessed of his works. I would say to all those listening out there, they are probably familiar with the idea that there is a Shakespeare authorship debate, that the whole issue is that the nominal accepted author did not write anything, had nothing to do with writing, creating the canon, which then gets into an almost 2-century long history of people who felt that, trying to find the true author. And for about 70 years, most people were looking at Francis Bacon. When J. Thomas Looney in 1920 published Shakespeare Identified, immediately most people saw, my God, this is the correct answer, this is a prototype of Hamlet. All sorts of pieces fell into place, and things immediately took off in the 1920s, as Jim Warren is now documenting in his research on the 20s and 30s. However, Looney did not really try to answer this question about how this happened. He was trying to establish the identity of the author and make the case for how all the pieces fit, and that the short story is that Hamlet is Shakespeare and Edward de Vere is a prototype of Hamlet. So that's the basics. However, you then go straight to the question of, well, how did this happen? How did someone this great...
I think you're right. I think that is the biggest question that I receive quite often from my colleagues, just friends of mine in the theater world. Whenever I bring this topic up, the first thing they say, it's actually they are more willing to believe that this is true, that Shakespeare is a pseudonym, that there is an actual identity of a real person behind that pseudonym. But the next question they ask is, why? Why did this happen? How did it happen? What caused this man to conceal himself?
Yes, and that is why within 10 years of Looney publishing his book, starting in the 1930s, people started looking for the answer. And they landed on the sonnets. Percy Allen and B.M. Ward, working together in the early 30s, looked at the sonnets, and the other revelation, it's not a revelation, everyone sort of understands it in their gut if they're into this at all and into literature and poetry, that the sonnets are personal and in all likelihood real. And that's the key word about the sonnets. Are they just literary exercises with no meaning, and they're a companion to a bunch of plays that are just derived from source material and written to make a buck? Or do we have a classic case of an author who is a genius, who is a poetic genius, but he is spilling his guts, that the Shakespeare canon and the poetry is personal? And once you cross that line, then you can start to dig through this material and look for this answer. Looney profiled the author out of the plays, and he identified the correct guy. All we are doing with the Prince Tudor theory, and it's been going on since the 30s, is taking the final step of going to the same material, the plays and poems, and trying to dig a little deeper and see if there are clues, hints and clues there that would tell us what is behind this amazing, event. I call it the dispossession. That's the way to think of this. The author was dispossessed of his works. And I would add to that, because this comes up frequently, why would Oxford give up the works? Why would he allow it to happen? And my short answer to that is that he didn't allow it. It was done to him, that he was sacrificed by higher powers for some reason, that he was, as the sonnets say, I to all the world must die, my name be buried where my body be. There's a sense right there with those two lines of an unwillingness to have this fate happen to him, but he accepted his fate. So we come back to this story. What happened?
There are many members in this movement who say that pseudonyms were very common in that time, that a lot of authors used them, that especially members of the nobility were using pseudonyms because it was looked upon with disfavor for these men of noble birth to involve themselves with the lowly actors and players of the stage and to be involved in this type of thing. So you're saying that that's not the case, that this was not a common aspect of writing of the time, this use of a pseudonym to conceal one's identity?
In his lifetime, yes. A useful analogy for this is, in his lifetime, was he wearing a mask? Yes. he was wearing a mask. This was common practice, and it was good politics and a good way to keep safe. The question is, after he died, how did it wind up that the full credit for this goes to a guy with no history and no credentials to have written the works? And how is it that 4 centuries later we are still fighting over this and looking for evidence, and has become an enormous big deal about why the true author cannot receive credit? Because basically with the Stratford story, the first level in this is once you see the virtual impossibility of the Stratford man having written these works, that once you see that Hamlet, Lear, and the sonnets are not just something written for no reason, or unless the reason was to make a buck and become famous. This gets back to the idea that everything is personal, and if it's personal, it's real.
So we've had a lot of guests on this program. We've had a lot of guests on this program, and some very prominent Oxfordians who are out there in the world publishing great works on this topic, who have covered what they believe to be the truth, the narrative that they have posited forward as to the how and why. But there still seems to be this great debate, this huge argument, both within the movement and outside the movement, about this idea that the Queen had a baby, or more than one baby, that as the film Anonymous points out, and I'm glad that we're talking about this today, because I've been asked by listeners to do an episode on my favorite film adaptations of Shakespeare's plays, which will be coming in the very near future. But this particular movie polarized a lot of people, and some say that it was this theory in the movie that killed the movie, and then there are some Oxfordians who say that it was the worst thing that ever happened to Oxfordianism, and then there are others who say it was the best thing that ever happened to Oxfordianism. Like, when did this all begin? You said it began in the 30s, but how did this come about that suddenly people went, oh, well, here's the obvious answer. The Earl of Southampton is the son of Edward de Vere and Queen Elizabeth, and that's the reason for this whole cover-up and why the sonnets exist, etc. Like, how did that all come about?
Well, it starts with, like classic storytelling, it starts at the end. So we have to look first at the 1590s and early 17th century, when Shakespeare appeared and the plays appeared, and then the first folio appeared. And the one undeniable fact that's available to everyone in this is that the Earl of Southampton, for some reason, is connected to Shakespeare. And the 2 major poems in 93, 94 of Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, with the dedications, is the first appearance of the Shakespeare name, and the name is not on plays, not even on sonnets. It's on these 2 lengthy narrative poems, which immediately then leads to, well, what are these poems about? What's the point? And why dedicate these poems to this kid at this point in time? So the answer is that you start the search at the end of the story, and you go backwards into history to try to look at what happened in the beginning that might help explain why at the end you had this linkage of Shakespeare, because we're not talking Oxford/Shakespeare. We have left Stratford. We are now in the zone of looking for answers. We have settled on Oxford. If you're looking at Marlowe or Neville or Bacon, this is why the Baconian theory finally crash landed on their code deciphering, because they couldn't come up with the story. We, as I said, have the story of Hamlet, but why is Hamlet joined at the hip? Maybe that's too far, but why is he so closely allied for some reason with Southampton? And throw in also that there's almost universal agreement that Southampton is the fair youth of the sonnets. And I know this would be a story you want to do another time, but there's the case of another poem called Willoughby His Avisa, which came out in 94, which is significant because it clearly links itself to the name Shakespeare and to the poem Lucrece. And in the middle of that poem is a weird exchange between W.S., an old actor, and W.H., a young man. That comes out of left field. W.S., everyone
that
agrees,
has been
is Shakespeare,
mentioned.
and W.H. is Southampton. So in the 2-year period in 93, 94, out of nowhere, all this stuff happens. And I'll give the short answer to all that I've arrived at, and this is how I argue the case now, it is about the big event of the 1590s is that Queen Elizabeth is now old. People are dying. Leicester has died. Walsingham's died. Leicester has died. Burleigh will die in 98. Who is in the on-deck circle? Who is going to be the next king of the, monarch of England? And unprecedented in history, in English history and in most histories, there is no named successor to Elizabeth, and she forbids discussion of the successor. She will not name it. There will not be an Elizabethan act of succession. She forbids the 92 Parliament from discussing the issue. This is the background to the 1590s, and simultaneous with this big push now in the 90s to name a successor, suddenly Shakespeare appears, linking himself to Southampton. And this is where people then trying to solve the problem have looked at this set of facts in the 90s and said, is this what's going on? Is this the connection?
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate for a minute and say, but there are quite a number of people out there who say, well, that's obvious. The author and Southampton were gay lovers and having this tumultuous gay love affair and needed to keep it a secret. And so that's the reason for the pseudonym and the hiding of the identities.
Because there's no documented history to align with the works. The other compelling thing about the Prince Tudor theory, and again the breakthrough that our mutual friend Hank Whittemore had on the sonnets in '99 and the Essex Rebellion, is that there is a lot of known history that can be aligned with the plays and the poems. And all that known history is about politics and succession, and an ongoing battle that went on for decades. And the strange situation, again, it took me many years. I've been doing this 40 years, and I've gone through several layers or several, sets, evolution, I guess you call it, about my understanding of the broader issue. And one of those understandings was, in the end, that the authorship debate is not about Shakespeare, it's about Elizabeth and the fate of the nation. And Oxford is totally wrapped up in his relationship with the Queen. In fact, the other relationship that has to be looked at here, when first there's Southampton, the other relationship, they're right in the center of his life, and you've covered this in some of your recent podcasts, it's Oxford and Elizabeth. And that whole, thing that is going on, and was he a lover of the Queen in the 1570s, as I think it was Mary, Queen of Scots, put in a letter, right? There was some recent thing about that.
Yes.
So you get into what Looney realized when he wrote the book, and he alludes to. He says the reason no one could find this guy is because he was buried. He was erased from history. He was one of the top 10 people in the realm for 50 years, his whole adult life. He's there in the room all the time in the room, and you have you have Burleigh and Leicester and Walsingham and the Queen. The other guy is Oxford.
I point that out regularly. In fact, you look at most biographies of Elizabeth, you look at all of the biopics, the documentary films, the movies starring, Kate Blanchett as the Queen or starring Helen Mirren as the Queen. I mean, there have been some magnificent films about Elizabeth's life, and nowhere ever do you ever see the Earl of Oxford in any of those films, even though, as you point out, we know historically he played such a major role in the court at the time and had this very contentious relationship with the Queen back and forth throughout his life and her life. But yet, as you say, he's been erased from history. So when the historians and the dramatists put together these things, they don't have any evidence of him. They don't have any details of him because you have to really dig to find it, like Oxfordians have done. And I think that that's like number one giant red flag right there about him and why this is such a major landmark signal towards the authorship.
Yeah, and one of the telltale signs that you realize the more you look at this is the letters of Oxford. Given his life and career and his associations in the theater and everything, how is it the 99% of the surviving letters are to William Cecil and Robert Cecil? And that's basically about it. There's a couple of things, but it gets into, you think, where is everything else? And then it gets into this other thing. You realize that there's a lot of stuff about other people and letters and documents. And this, as I say, I think is a telltale sign that there's been some sanitizing of the record vis-a-vis Oxford.
And you're saying and pointing out that if the great controversy of the day was this gay love affair between Oxford and Southampton, that it would not warrant this type of sanitization of the record. It would not warrant this type of shielding and trying to eliminate or erase the quote unquote scandal of it all.
Yeah, yes. If it was just a gay love affair and a family scandal, it's understandable there'd be a cover-up in the lifetime, there'd be efforts made not to talk about it, etc., etc. But a cover-up that then went past his death, that wound up with the first folio and all its peculiarities, and the monument in Stratford, and the whole tradition that the Shakespeare canon came out of the imagination of the illiterate Stratford man, that is a big deal.
I find it interesting.
That's why you go back in history. That's why the more you look at the end game, how this ended for everyone, you then go back into history, back into the 1580s, the 70s, the 60s. In fact, once I realized we were going to have this talk today, in the last week I've been going all the way back to the 1530s and 20s, because I was starting to read about a guy called Henry Fitzroy, the bastard son of Henry VIII. And I'll save that for another day. I don't want to go off in that avenue, but that should be looked at, because that is Exhibit A in a monarch caring passionately about who will succeed him, wanting a legitimate son, going through 3 acts of succession as he picks and chooses who's going to succeed him, and ultimately breaking with the Roman Catholic Church over the issue of his right to a male heir. It's a rather big deal, and all that is a mere couple of decades before Elizabeth, who's the daughter of
I was just having a conversation earlier this week with one of our fellow Quillers who was bringing up that issue. She said, if Henry VIII had just acknowledged that bastard son, none of this would have ever happened, and we wouldn't even be talking about this today. I think that's very unique.
I'm going to tease you. I came across something this week that it's in the books. It's been there the whole time. It's a fact about this. Do you want me to do breaking news at this point, or should we save it?
Oh, I think you should save that one. Again, there's a whole nother story. Oh wait, don't want to upset Bob Stanley across the pond. There's an entirely different story that we'll touch on at another time.
Yes, but it gets into these issues about succession. You see, it's relevant in terms of Henry VIII succession, male heir, all that happened when he died, the short reign of Edward, the short reign of Bloody Mary, and then Elizabeth takes the throne in 58, and she says, I am married to England, so I'm not going to have a husband. She launched this thing right from the get-go, and you can understand, it's like, having experienced what she experienced, yes, it makes sense. And then by the end of the 60s, as was shown in one of the famous recent Elizabeth movies, there were several, but there's one that ends with her being painted white, and she is becoming the Virgin Mary.
Yes.
Right. So it accentuates the idea that there was a deliberate, calculated decision for her to be the Virgin Mary. So you had, with this church that was founded by Henry in bloodshed, frankly, in a big break with Rome over his right to have a legitimate male heir.
Bloodshed and adultery. If you look at it, it's kind of hard to argue that there wasn't some sort of, sinful origin to the entire Church of England at that time.
That's why I say I've learned things this week I didn't know, and I've talked to a few people. It was like, the classic, we all do this. If you're really into this issue, I do a phone call, listen to this, and I read something out of a book. Oh my God, you're kidding me. No, it's right here in a book. It's been there the whole time. Some little fact that everyone overlooked. And all of it falls back into, though, this issue of the Tudors' succession, the decision of Elizabeth to be the Virgin Queen, which is problematic because the way business is done is succession. So they, for decades, were playing this bizarre double game. And what I say to people is, They cannot have gone throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s into the 90s with no plan. There had to have been some kind of plan of some sort. And
when
this
you look at the
why
history
people wind
of
up
William
saying,
Cecil,
well, she's rumored to have had babies, and then can you legitimize a bastard? And the short answer to that is yes, you can.
and if you look at the history of William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, that guy was so calculating and so strategic that it's obvious that he would have had some sort of plan, and that plan would have been someone other than James of Scotland, and that James of Scotland became the de facto king. And when we talk about this, is something I also find very interesting. When you talk about James, for instance, we have more evidence of James having homosexual relationships than we have evidence of anyone else having homosexual relationships. And so if that was such a scandal, why wasn't there a big cover-up to hide the king's dalliances? And why would it be so important then to hide the dalliances of these two particular noblemen? And that's one of the things that doesn't tend to make very much sense to me.
No, that's an excellent point. I mean, he was notorious in Buckingham, and the whole thing, that the whole rise of Buckingham was like, he was James's boy toy, to put it bluntly. So it's there, and it's known and talked about, which brings us back to, so what in the world is going on under Elizabeth in this bizarre situation of a monarch who has no successor and refuses to name one and orders everyone else not to even discuss it? What in the world is going on? See, that gets into then looking at the 1590s, and that's why people like myself and others, like Hank and a lot of people, and going all the way back to to Percy Allen and B.M. Ward, as they looked at this in the 30s, they were saying, no, that what's at stake here is the succession to the kingdom. This is the big thing to fight over. This is at the top of anyone's list. If you want to possess something, why not possess a whole nation? What's better than that? So they can't have just left England lying around unclaimed for 40 years.
And so you argue that the plan was to legitimize Southampton as the Queen's rightful heir and to make him the new King of England at some point.
Yes, and you could follow from that, because you had Bonner Miller Cutting on recently, and I listened to that episode a few days ago. She will not be a mother. And it was very interesting that Bonner examined the history of 48 and said, well, it's just, she had to have had a kid. Everything indicates that Elizabeth had a baby in November, December 48. And then she goes way out of her way to say that that baby couldn't be the Earl of Oxford, and no one knows what's happened to it, and let's move on. My take on that is that I did not know about the line in Burleigh's letter. This is amazing if your listeners haven't heard of this. I think she mentioned it in the podcast. She will not be a mother is what William Cecil wrote to his son Robert. It's the last message he sent him in August of 98. She will not be a mother. And I did not know this until I read Bonner's article in about 10 years ago now. And I said, that is the perfect answer to our theory of the 1590s. She refuses to acknowledge that she ever had a kid, let alone had a kid that could be the next King of England. And they are sitting there in the 1590s thinking they had a deal, thinking the whole time that, of course, when push comes to shove, of course she'll say, yes, I had a baby. We will now proceed with legitimizing the baby and securing the succession. And
of course, Burleigh tries to arrange the marriage of his granddaughter to the Earl of Southampton, thinking, great, I will become a great-grandfather of kings.
Yeah.
And of course, Henry Wriothesley, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. If you believe he's the son of Edward de Vere, well, he sure does act a lot like him. He sure does behave a lot like him. He does seem to follow some of the same patterns. If it is like father, like son, that there's a great argument there, because Henry Wriothesley is definitely just as hot-headed and just as impetuous as Edward de Vere is. Now, some would argue it's because he was a protege of Edward de Vere, because they had this hot homosexual love affair, but the other side argues that it's like father, like son, and there may be some genetic connection to this hot-headed, this impetuous behavior and others who would argue that part of it is because he knew he was a prince. And when you have that kind of internal knowledge, you tend to let it go to your head and you tend to behave in a vainglorious way. And that could be argued that that's one of the reasons why Henry Wriothesley does the things that he does throughout his life, is that he has this internal knowledge that he could be the new king of England someday.
But only if the Queen acknowledges his existence. See, that's the rub in the whole thing. That's the mind-blowing fact about this, that 20, 30 years ago, maybe it wasn't as clear in my mind as it is now, which is why she will not be a mother, father to son. As I'm about to die, my boy, and you're about to take over, that's our problem. She won't be a mother, so we have no successor. And I'd further say, this gets back to the Shakespeare and the Shakespeare canon, that my view has become that Oxford, of course, was a genius. He's writing probably as a teenager in the 60s, the 70s. He's working at Fisher's Folly. He's working with the university wits and all the famous people of the 80s. He's the seminal figure in founding English theater, not the traditional story of coming in last and stealing it. But you get to the 1590s. And I think I also believe he was the son, that he was the baby born in 48, and he was placed in the John de Vere household. And that's another area I disagree with Bonner's take on that in her article, where she says, well, it was all falling apart, who'd want to take it over? And my thought immediately was, it's all falling apart, it's ripe for taking over. And they did take it over. Placing the baby in the household began Elizabeth, Burleigh, and Leicester taking over the Oxford fortune. And because they had total control, because if the kid was the Queen's baby, that was the end. So you see, this gets into this whole notion about what is or isn't a fact, and that everything has to be laid on a table and interpreted. And finally, you have to align things. You have to look at the historical record as you have it, and then compare it to what people are saying in letters or in writing or in, plays and poems. And if things start to match up, and that's where the homosexual theory, I think, just falls flat, because all the language does appear to be loving. There's all sorts of arguments for glossing certain words like sensual as being sexual, but there's no known history of much sexual misbehavior or dalliance or anything. There's a few hints here or there, I believe. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but
and if you want to get
story.
If you want to get into documented evidence on that topic, there is the story of Oxford being accused by those who were trying to destroy him of such behavior. They accused him of sodomy. They accused him of bringing back the boy from Italy to be his personal boy toy. Except the documented evidence shows that in inquest on that, none of that was proven to be true. When they cross-examined the young boy, he said that absolutely did not happen. So there's actual documented evidence against that theory out there, as opposed to support that theory. Wouldn't you say that? That's something
there are accusations, but again, there's not supporting evidence. In fact, another view I have of all this, number one, it is interesting he brought the boy back from Italy, and maybe it was simply true. Maybe he loved boys, he loved the boy's voice. He did have a loving mentor-like relationship with him, not necessarily sexual. To me, one of the stranger things about Elizabethan England is this whole notion of the children's theater, and this whole thing they were doing for decades of having adolescent boys play all the women's roles. I mean, if you want to get into some strange stuff going on, I mean, that there is sort of like Exhibit A on, what is going on in the theater world. So I would say that's an argument towards, okay, there's something going on here, but that would then get back to, is this a reason for what happened in the end, which is not just a little mistake, we misplaced the Shakespeare works. This is like an enormous thing that happened to dispossess the guy, erase him from history, and go through a convoluted process to give full credit to the Shakespeare canon to the guy from Stratford, who, as Diana Price demonstrates in her book, you examine this guy, he's at the bottom of the list. He scores straight zeros across the board on leaving a paper trail where everyone else for decades left a paper trail.
Exactly right.
It's rather
And
amazing.
the other thing I think is interesting too, with regards to Oxford's sexuality, remember, he gets thrown in prison because he has an illicit love affair with a woman, not with a man.
Yeah.
Not only that, but
Orazio was home free, but Anne Vavasor, oh yes.
right. He fathers 7 total children, I believe. They don't all survive, but I believe he fathers 7 total children, and according to the record, would be from at least 3 different women. So he was definitely a womanizer to some degree.
Yeah, but he was at the very least bisexual, and maybe he had a thing being a theater guy and an artsy guy. Maybe he had a thing for attractive men. Maybe he had a thing for some boys, maybe. But is that the story? You see, it comes back to, I don't want to slam the door on it. I don't want to go down this road that we've been down in this movement about who is or isn't homophobic. You see, that's a red herring kind of argument. I'm simply saying, I don't care one way or the other. Given that it's theater, given everything we know, yes, maybe stuff was going on. But the thing we're trying to solve is, how did the greatest writer in Western letters, one of the greatest writers, maybe the greatest if you want to call him that, how did he wind up dispossessed of his life's work? And not just dispossessed, erased. You know, as I like to joke, at least Essex is remembered. His head was chopped off. Oxford's identity, his existence, is what they chopped off. He received the worst punishment of everyone in the era.
That's a great analogy, and I think it's very fitting to think that this was a punishment placed upon him, regardless of what the reason was. If we can all agree that this was a punishment placed upon him, that at least takes us one step closer to a narrative. And I tend to be of the mind of Justice Stevens, the late departed Justice Stevens, who came upon the Shakespeare Authorship Question and found it to be valid in his own mind, and who argued that the biggest problem we have as Oxfordians is that we don't have a cohesive narrative to follow. And it makes sense when you look at that brilliant legal mind of his, and I often compare this to the O.J. Simpson trial, which was the reason O.J. Simpson got acquitted is because the prosecution didn't have a narrative that the jury could believe in and buy. There were too many holes in it. It was too broken up. And that whole line of, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And I think that that's part of the problem that we have as Oxfordians, is that we don't have something we can deliver to the jury being the general public out there, that says, here's exactly what happened and why it happened. And the sooner we can come to some sort of cohesive narrative that we can all agree on, I think the sooner this movement finally moves forward the way that it should and needs to.
Well, I agree, but it's us, all of us Oxfordians, having to find a way to agree or to agree to disagree, which is a phrase I actually hate because, you know, again, I like analogies, and an analogy here is you come to a fork in the road, and you got to go one way or the other. And I think the fork in the road is the homosexual theory, but it's also a whole umbrella of personal theories, personal, family, love interest, adultery, a whole thing, versus political. And this, again, is where Stevens quotes. Stevens, you know, he said this at the end of the trial in 87, and he summed up brilliantly all the key words. He said that Burleigh and the Queen conspired, and I wouldn't hesitate to call it a conspiracy. They conspired that this man must be separated from the works for some reason, but we don't know what it is. He then amazingly goes on to say, and I'm paraphrasing here, it may turn out that the thesis about what this reason is so improbable it's not even worth pursuing. So think of that. So he said, and it took me years. It was only in recent years, and it was after he died, I thought, my God, he's been there for decades. No one ever asked him to explain that quote, because I suddenly found myself thinking, he is aware of the Prince Tudor theory. He's aware of all the ins and outs, the incest implications. You see, that's the bombshell in all this. You get to the incest implications here. That is where all of a sudden it's like, no, we ain't going there.
I wonder if Justice Stevens was a fan of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes mysteries, because that statement raises a a similarity to me in what Doyle wrote in the guise of Sherlock Holmes, and it's prevalent in my mind right now because I actually happen to be directing a murder mystery for our local theater company up here in Southern Oregon, and it's based on William Gillette, who is the actor who first originated the role of Sherlock Holmes on the stage with Conan Doyle's permission. And, you know, there's that famous line that Sherlock Holmes says, "Exclude the impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth."
Yes, great quote. And there it is. And, you know, the other thing I noticed, again, recently with the articles in the newsletter, and we've been, you know, writing about this, is the word improbable is also used by J. Thomas Looney in 1933 when he wrote a letter back to someone who was complaining about the initial, when the initial appearance of the Prince Tudor theory popped up, immediately the pushback and the flap started. And famously, Looney wrote a letter and said, "This will bring us into disrepute." And he used the word, I forget the exact, I don't have it in front of me, but he used the word improbable. We cannot, we cannot embrace this improbable theory that will only bring us into disrepute and ridicule. So even starting with him, right from the get-go, the theory no sooner appears than the father of the theory distances himself, which would bring us all the way up to, as you said a few minutes ago, anonymous. And the whole flap that happened over that, which is, again, is why I wound up putting together this book, A Poet's Rage. And as I say in my introduction, in the midst of yet another shouting match over Prince Tudor, you know, someone said, "We should put all this in a book." And I said, yes, that's a good idea. We'll have our history of Prince Tudor. Here's an overview. But part of what the book is about, part of it is to demonstrate, and again, many people acknowledge this, the Prince Tudor theory answers many questions. It's
let's tell our readers where they can find
extraordinary.
That. How can I find a copy of that if I'd like to read it, the Poet's Rage?
Oh, it's on Amazon. It's on Amazon, and there's a Kindle on Amazon.
Excellent. And it's listed under author William Boyle.
It'll come up as editor, editor/author, but it's really, I have 3 articles in it on the editor, but it's A Poet's Rage, which is taken from, I got it in front of me here. And again, this was suggested to me. The title was suggested to me. I want to give him full credit by Charles Beauclerc. It's Sonnet 17. "And your true rights be termed a poet's rage and stretched meter of an antique song." Again,
so let's go down this path just a bit more. So if the sonnets, again, playing devil's advocate here, if the sonnets are written to the fair youth as this sequence of love poems that are sexual in nature, not paternal in nature, then they come way after the original writings of love, if you could call them that, which would be Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. Why would an older man write those poems to a younger man if he was trying to take him to bed? That doesn't make any sense to me. Those are definitely not love poems the way I read them.
Well, I have come to believe, and this comes, again, in the last 10 years, working with Peter Rush on his book about the sonnets, Hidden in Plain Sight, which also is an excellent book. You can get it on Amazon, which is a detailed analysis of the sonnets from the monument theory point of view. So the view I've come to is that the first 17 sonnets, which are traditionally just seen as the poet trying to urge the youth to marry, as Peter pointed out, and it's probably been pointed out by others, he's actually urging procreation, not marriage. The whole thing is about making another self.
Right, have a baby. Go make a baby.
And the other thing, as I look, and this is one of the books I took out here, because I have this marked up copy of the sonnets, where again, at this time, I went through the first 17 and started marking them up and realizing what was sort of, again, hidden in plain sight, that so many of these lines in the first 17 sonnets are about, your house will decay. Who lets so fair a house fall to decay, which husbandry and honor might uphold? That's in sonnet 13. Against this coming end you should prepare, and your sweet semblance to some other give. He's addressing this to a teenager? No. And then it hit me. He's addressing this to Elizabeth.
I agree with that. I think he's telling her, you need to have a child, and if you already have one, you need to acknowledge that child. The time
that
is
the key.
Yeah,
that she had the kid.
True.
She knows it. They know it. Everyone knows she had the kid. What's missing is, because she's publicly the Virgin Queen, then she has no kids officially. You see, this gets into the whole realm of official stories. So officially, she has no kids, and officially, in the 1590s, they can't just hop up on a soapbox and says, I have an announcement to make. I am the son of the Virgin Queen. Well, you can't do that. That is treason, no matter who you are. Right. Which gets back to what Cecil wrote to his son in 1598. She will not be a mother. That's our problem, kid. We thought we had a deal. For 30 years, we thought we had a deal. And push comes to shove in the 90s, and now's the time. And she looks us all in the eye and says, I'm the Virgin Queen.
And she won't admit it. So
she won't admit it, which is
instead of interpreting it as she will not be a mother, as in she will never have a baby, the interpretation is she will not admit to being a mother. She will not agree to being a maternal figure. That she refuses to acknowledge her womb in any way.
Yes, which is why the way the quote appears, this struck me again. This was in Bonner's article. She ends the article with this quote, and it sort of struck me because then she says, the quote is, though she will not be a mother, yet she showed herself by feeding me with her own princely hand, as a careful nurse. And Bonner says the careful nurse was not the queen. The careful nurse is Cecil, the guy who's being fed by the woman. And I thought, what? No, I mean, I just went back and looked at this material the last few days. I went, wow, no, I mean, it's not just she will not be a mother. The irony is that Cecil is saying, but she's a woman. She can take care of a baby, and I'm an old man. I'm the classic thing. I'm an old man. I'm like a baby. I'm dying. I have to be fed with the spoon. And the Queen of England is feeding me like a nurse.
But she definitely had I say she definitely loved Cecil. He was her father figure. And I think that's proven through the documentation of how she grieved his death when he died.
He was on the scene in 48. I forget the details, but the other part of the 1548-49 story is that it's the 30-year-old William Cecil is part of the young lawyer helping to engineer the solution to the Queen's problem. So he knows the secret. You see, this gets into then Cecil, you see, and he's always in the background. He's never quite suspected of being the guy. And yet, you look at all this history and you're thinking he was the guy from day one. He knew the biggest secret of them all.
There's a great moment in one of the films, and I can't recall right now which film it is, where Elizabeth is depicted as grieving, as being distraught, and the actor who plays Cecil, it's a wonderful moment of filmmaking, and the director of the film has the actor who plays Cecil reach as though he's going to try to hug her or console her in that moment, and then she snaps back and he retreats. And it's a wonderful moment that I think depicts the true nature of the relationship that the two of them had. It was, I think, very much a loving relationship within the confines of what it could be. And they spent so much time together. He arguably is the most important person in her life throughout her life.
Well, some historians have said it was the age of Cecil. It was the Cecilian age,
absolutely,
not the Elizabethan age. You see,
in many ways, I believe that's true.
Well, then it gets into what is the true nature of their relationship. And I think it's a very symbiotic thing that went on for their lifetimes, that she's the queen, but he's the guy that's running things. And it goes back and forth about the
ultimate
power.
Kingmaker. He took a queen and turned her into a king.
Yes. And as she said, I have the heart and stomach of a king, she said in 1588, which then brings us back to the 90s. You see, and this is what I think I've learned in all this. And this gets into the truth about why Oxford appeared on the scene. Another running joke I have used sometimes, and I'll use it here. Shakespeare comes out of nowhere. It's like, wow, where did this guy come from? what's he about, what does he want, and why is he writing these poems to the Earl of Southampton? And I'm saying it's the succession, that this, whatever deal they thought they had for decades, was blown up because she will not be a mother. And they're all going, well, what's plan B? And it turns out plan B is, I will not be a mother. And don't talk about it and shut up.
There certainly are quite a number of prominent Oxfordians who agree with you, who have written and published great works on this topic. Many of them have been guests on this program. Catherine Chilgen's Shakespeare Suppressed, which was the most popular podcast episode for this series of all of 2020. Hank Whittemore, who's been a frequent guest, and his episodes are always very popular with our listeners as well. I've been trying to get Jim Warren on the program, but he's been so busy with the work that he's doing, cataloging Looney's writings and Looney's work. He also subscribes to this theory. So there's a lot of very prominent Oxfordians out there. Jim Warren, Oxfordian of the Year, in fact, who are in this camp. There are also others in the organization, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, who are adamantly against this. In fact, in some cases, some have even tried to just shut down all inquiry into this topic. And of course, that would be antithetical to this program, of course, because, our slogan is keep asking questions. And I believe that we need to ask these questions. We need to ask every question. We need to look into every angle, every aspect to try to get to the truth. That's the goal here, is to try to get to the truth. And we can't find the truth if we don't keep digging in every pit, even if that pit becomes a bottomless one.
Yes,
but you did mention something. You said, Looney was concerned about ridicule. Stevens talked about how improbable the theory may be. And I find that ironic. I actually find that funny, because if Oxfordians were afraid of ridicule, they should be Stratfordians.
Yes. Alex,
the very nature of the Shakespeare Authorship Question brings about that quote-unquote ridicule that we're all so afraid of. I've been ridiculed for hosting this podcast series as a tinfoil wearing crackpot. So, if ridicule is what we're afraid of, I think we're in the wrong business.
No. Alex McNeil points, that's his favorite line over and over when this topic comes up. He says, if you're an Oxfordian, ridicule comes with the territory, period. And that's why a lot of people come and go. I don't know what it is, but once I got into this, I stayed. I'm still here. It can be maddening and frustrating, but it is interesting as all hell, and I think important.
There have been several people in the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship and guests on this podcast series who have suggested that a big part of the issue, big part of the problem is we've been barking up the wrong tree. We've been banging our heads against the doors of academia for so long. And there are certain scholars within the organization, I feel, who just won't be satisfied unless some English professor at some major university suddenly has a change of heart and says, "You're right, you guys are all brilliant." And I think that's like the child who's consistently trying to receive recognition and approval from a parent that isn't ever going to happen. And I feel like one of those issues is that we need to stop knocking on the doors of the English departments, and we need to start knocking on the doors of the history departments.
Yes,
because I think this is a historical question, not a literary question in the sense of what really happened and why.
Yes, and that's why I say the term official story is a way to look at this. That then sets it in its political context that people are aware of, because basically official stories are not true stories. That's why they're official. And people kind of understand that, but then it gets you right into the dangerous territory of being a conspiracy theorist.
Because it's a conspiracy to think that government would lie. It's a conspiracy to think that government would try to pull one over on the populace. Oh my goodness, what?
Yeah, but
especially a totalitarian government, a monarchy.
But it gets into our time too. You see, that's what I'm saying. So there's this interesting divide here about what is or isn't conspiracy, and I simply say no. I can't agree with nothing is, and I can't agree with everything is. It's like everything else in life. You got to examine the case at hand and see if something is going on behind closed doors, if there's something more going on than just what appears to be going on. I mean, hell, even Ronald Reagan said trust but verify. That was his tagline in the 80s, which is kind of ironic.
But
that's what
right.
we're up against. Now, I would just add here, because I was at that trial in '87. I went and I took pictures, and there was a big thing at that time among Gordon Sear and Ogburn about conspiracy, and they were trying to not be branded as conspiracy theorists because we were still hot and heavy into the JFK stuff from the 70s and 80s. And they wanted to keep a distance from that, which is why it was big news in a way that Stevens said what he said. He said, I would not hesitate to call it a conspiracy. The two most powerful people in England decided we can't have the world know this guy wrote these plays. And Stevens says, I buy that. I wonder what the reason is.
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, there's one other thing I want to get in here. I see we're getting close to the end of time here. The other interesting thing in all this debate is new facts keep popping up, which again just reinforce that we're on the right track. Number one is the Southampton Tower poem that was published by an academic scholar in 2011, which totally reinforces the view of the monument theory that all the middle sonnets and all the begging for mercy is about Southampton's fate. All the legal language is about the legal situation of the trial. And then, as Robert Prechter published last year in the newsletter, which I consider a bombshell, and no one has talked about it. I mentioned it again, and in the current issue, John Hamill does address it, but he says it's just another rumor. And if your listeners weren't aware of this, he found in a very obscure, monster-long, boring history book a reference very late in the game which said that the Queen of England concealed a Prince of Wales. I not wot the skill. So it's a strange I not wot the skill, which is a convoluted way of saying I do not understand the policy decision about why the Queen would conceal a Prince of Wales. So there it is, staring us in the face for about 18 months now, since I think it was last summer's newsletter. 2019, I think.
That's a great opportunity for me to say to our listeners that if they're unaware of these newsletters, it's because they are not members of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. And if you become a member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, you have access to those quarterly newsletters. You can choose when you sign up to be a member at the website. You can choose whether you want to receive hard copies of the newsletter in the mail or just access them digitally. I like to have them in my hand. I'm a hard copy subscriber to the newsletter because I like to get them in the mail, and I like to actually hold them in my hand and look through them and read them, and I keep them in a file where I have all of the ones that I've received over the years that I've been a member. But others can choose to just receive them digitally, and you get your membership code to access them through the website. And that is all included in your membership. Not only that, but your membership does help to support other activities of the organization, such as the sponsorship of this podcast, our video contest outreach program, which is great, our research program, which is continuing to fund further research into this topic. So if you're out there and you've been on the fence about joining the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, please go to the website, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. Click on the button, join. It's not expensive, and you'll feel good about the fact that you are supporting research into this topic, as well as you'll have access to new materials and things that you otherwise might not be receiving, including that wonderful quarterly newsletter.
Yes, and through our library and store, you will have access to everything ever published in the last 100 years, catalog records. 2/3 of them are now linked to digital copies, and the other third will be in another 12, 18 months maybe. So
That's
the
fantastic.
whole 100 years of scholarship will be at your fingertips.
And you can rabbit hole all day long and continue to dig and continue to find and come to the determination on your own of what you believe and what theory you think is the one that makes the most sense. I mean, I've made it pretty clear where I'm leaning and what camp I subscribe to. And part of that is based on my own particular biases. I'm a father. I have 3 children. And when I read the sonnets, I see a very paternal type of love there. Others who maybe aren't a parent and don't have that, don't view it from that lens and see it in a different lens. I think we all bring our own personal views and biases to everything that we look at. But I think that if we close our minds to anything, or if we refuse to acknowledge others who are asking questions in certain areas, I think we become the enemy. We become like those who we are fighting against, the Stratfordians, who use that argument to shut us down regularly. And I think that we have to be careful about closing off topics on this issue, because if we do that, then we start to look just like them and we give them fuel for their fire against us.
No, absolutely. But yet I'd add to that, though, that if we are all looking for the answer, at some point, another analogy I like to use, I'm big on sports. I like to follow all the major games, have all my life. The interesting thing is, out on the field of play, you get an answer, a winner, loser in a game, a winner, loser in a season. I have come to believe that there's a certain strain, and I can understand it, that it is fun to be involved in the hunt and all the different things going on. But as Justice Stevens said, if you want to prevail, if you want to get the world to recognize that Oxford was the true Shakespeare, at some point there has to be some kind of agreement on a macro theory of what this is about. And I think, as you said at the beginning of this podcast, that people are looking for what is this about? Something I can sink my teeth into. And the 2 major theories are the personal sexual scandal, family scandal, versus a political conspiratorial scandal. And I feel that everything falls on the side of the political conspiratorial power politics. The whole nation of England is at stake. Not just a family's reputation, it's the possession of the nation of England.
I know there are members out there, Hank Whittemore being one of them particularly, who are more than willing to debate this topic with anyone and everyone. Several years ago, not that long ago, we at one of our conferences, it was our conference in Oakland, we had a magnificent debate as part of our conference about the identity of the Dark Lady of the Sonnets.
Yes.
And it was an incredibly enlightening discussion to witness and observe. There was an informal vote held of those who were in attendance of where they were persuaded or what they felt or believed. And it didn't mean that you had to subscribe to the majority outcome, but it was nice to know what the majority believed after watching that debate. I know we haven't been able to have in-person conferences for some time now, and I'm hoping that someday soon we'll be able to enjoy all gathering together again. But through digital platforms, we could still hold these types of debates. And I think that that's something that's lacking in the organization that we really need to embrace. We need to be having these. And if they get heated and passionate, then so be it. I think it demonstrates to the viewers and the newest members that that's exactly why we all do this. We are passionate about it. We do all love the work. That's the one thing we all have in common. We love the work. We want the truth. And in order to get at the truth, I think we need to embrace each other's ideas, thoughts, and research and really openly discuss these topics, not shy away from them. So I'm going to be encouraging, as a member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, that we start adding a debate to our conferences, our symposiums, at least one every year or 2 every year, but at least one at every event on some topic. Does it have to be right off the bat the Prince Tudor topic? Maybe not. Maybe it does. Maybe that's where we need to begin and then get down to the nitty-gritty. But definitely I think that nothing ill comes from this type of vigorous inquest into these topics.
Yeah, and I agree. Panels and debates are an excellent way to get things out there and kicked around. And yeah, there ought to be at least one panel and one debate at each conference mixed in with the papers.
Well, I'll be placing that forward to the powers that be, and anybody out there who supports that idea, I encourage you to write to the Board of Trustees of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship with your opinions and your ideas. In fact, don't forget, as a member of the organization, it is a democratic organization. Everyone has a say, everyone has a vote. And that's another benefit of being a member, is that you get to contribute to the future of the organization, not just financially, but also through participation. So we encourage you again, if you haven't already joined the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, please go to the website, click on that button. It's a very modest annual fee, and you will not only be able to support the organization, but also participate and contribute in the organization's leadership and its direction moving forward. Bill, we're out of time. It's been a great conversation. I'm so grateful to you for taking the time to come on the program and share this topic and explain to our listeners why it's so important, where it came from, how long it's been around. We barely scratched the surface, but I think the whole point of today's episode was to let our listeners know why it exists, why it's so contentious, what the issues surrounding it are, and now they can go to the website, they can go to the publications, they can find the book that you mentioned, Poet's Rage, and do further reading. Obviously, we know Shakespeare Suppressed, Catherine Children's great book, is a wonderful resource. Hank Whittemore's The Monument is a giant resource on this topic. And there are other publications out there that espouse the other topic. And in fact, you can view last year's Oxfordian of the Year, Cheryl Egan Donovan's documentary film on the topic, where she supports the bisexual, homosexual position of Edward de Vere. And that's out there as well. So go watch, go read, go learn, and come to your own conclusions, because as we always say here on the program, it's important to keep asking questions.
Yes, and go to SOAR.
SOAR.
Throwing a pitch for the SOAR catalog with all the links to all the articles. There's a link on the
spell out the acronym
homepage
for the listeners who don't know what SOAR is.
Shakespeare Online Authorship Resources.
Shakespeare Online Authorship Resources.
There are 8,500 records in it now, which represent research articles, reviews, conference reports, news reports, obituaries, all sorts of stuff. For example, if you go to SOAR, there's a link on the right-hand side of the fellowship page. Click on SOAR. You'll see the opening page in the search box at the top. Just put in Prince Tudor in the search box. On the sort order next to it, click on oldest first, and you will see a display from 1930s to date of the articles we have in SOAR so far. We haven't subject tagged everything, but there's more than 100 different articles, letters, reviews, and stuff on this topic, ranging from the 1930s through last year.
Fantastic. That's a fantastic resource for our listeners, and I know that thanks to the emails that we receive regularly from listeners, that this is a topic that they're very interested in and that they want to know more about. We want to remind our listeners, if you would like to help support the program, you can do so by also going to dragonwagonradio.com, go to the Dragon Wagon shop, and buy some Quiller swag. I'm drinking coffee right now out of my Don't Quill the Messenger coffee mug. I have a Don't Quill the Messenger mouse pad underneath my mouse here at my desktop computer. I wear my Don't Quill the Messenger face covering when I'm out in public these days. People ask me about it all the time. It's the mask behind the mask behind the mask. It's a great topic of conversation when I'm out and about in public. I also have my Don't Quill the Messenger t-shirts. All of those items are great conversation pieces, great way to show your support for the program and help benefit the costs of producing the program as well. So please consider doing that. And ladies and gentlemen, send us your email, send us your comments, because you too might get a shout out, just like Bob Stanley here on today's program, or Quiller Claire, who happened to be the person I was talking to about Henry VIII's illegitimate son. So give us a shout out, give us a message, and you too might be mentioned here on the program, or we might even use your suggestion for a future podcast episode. We appreciate you being loyal listeners. We appreciate your support. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.